Hey, Ben Brook back. Thank you for joining me. This is a very short video that I'm just going to, that I'm putting together because one of my followers asked me how I had customized my Schrade 56L here. And I just want to kind of walk him through the process. It's very simple. I'm no expert. There are a lot of people who do a much nicer job than I did with this, but it's something that anybody can do with relatively few tools. And so I thought I would show a little bit of a short video here, just how to do it, and kind of walk him through the process since he asked a good question. So I don't have a video showing how I made it, but I will explain it in this video and show you the products that I used. All right, without further ado, let's move on. Okay, Ben Brook back. Now, the knife in question that I was asked about is the Schrade 56L, and what I did to it is I stripped the original handles off, or took the original handles off. I stripped the blade of the coating that it came with, filed down the spine, added some green liners and some black walnut handles, shaped it to what really felt good in my big old clunking hands. And then the other thing I did was I put in some brass pins here. So I just want to kind of walk people through that process for those who are interested and explain how I did that. So first and foremost, you have to take off the original Schrade handle scales. Nothing really wrong with these. They're real grippy. A little bit on the thin side for me by the time you put that blade in there, but not terribly uncomfortable. Just a couple of bolts, not a big deal. Just find the right size head and you're good to go in terms of removing those. So that's the easy part. Next thing I did was I got out my Jasco Premium paint and epoxy remover, the 15-minute fastest removal. And I used an old pan, basically a paint pan that I was not using anymore. And I took the blade without any handles on it, just put it in there, sprayed it with the Jasco, and let it sit for a while. And that gradually soaked it. After that, after 15 minutes, 30 minutes, I can't remember how long it was I left it in there, I began to get a brass bristle brush, and I started scraping things off. I also used an old spackling knife, a thin 1-inch spackling knife, just to kind of scrape the Jasco off. It kind of creates this film that comes off fairly easily. And then I was left with a relatively clean blade, but it wasn't perfect. Okay, so to get it more perfect, I went to my wet dry sandpaper box, and I have all sorts of different grits here. Let's see. There's 1,000, a 600, I have a 400, I have a 1,500, I have a 2,000, just all kinds of stuff. And so what I did was I worked from finer to coarser to try to get a lot of the imperfections and kind of create a nicer looking surface on there as far as the blade goes. And that allowed me to get the metal, the blank basically, if you will, clean. Paid particular attention to clean the handle scales because I knew I was going to be epoxying them later. Okay, so clean knife, relatively sharp knife, I can set that aside for the time being. Now, because Schrade was billing this as a bushcraft knife, I kind of like the idea of having wooden scales on it, and I like the old wooden brass sort of look. I've done it, with other knives. I made a Kephart out of an old hickory one. And I had a huge block of this wood. This is black walnut. And so what I did, just put it on my table saw, and I ripped it down to the thickness that I wanted for handle scales, the number of pieces. This is a scrap. This wasn't necessarily the piece that I used by any means. Just a piece I found in my shop for purposes of this video. And I cut handle scales out. I traced these originally to kind of get the shape of the handle scales. Put a little extra on the outside so that I had something that I could sand and file off to kind of move it down. Now you have a choice to make depending on how you plan to use the knife, whether more indoors or outdoors or things like that. Wood is susceptible to moisture, so one of the things to think about is whether or not you want to use a wood hardener on your handle scales. That can be a little bit tricky, a little bit involved. In this case, I did not. These are only treated with boiled linseed oil, and I'll show you that can a little bit later in terms of the process. And that could be a risk. If these get really wet or something like that, they could swell. It could cause some problems. But I don't really plan to risk it in that fashion, so it wasn't a big deal for me. Okay, now you'll notice that these also do have some green liners on it. You can make these liners out of a million different things because they're basically glued in place. There's not a lot that can happen to liners. You just kind of want them to hold up and provide that sort of accent color. And I picked the green because it's sort of a reminder and homage to the green that the Schrade boxes come in. And I kind of like the way it made the black walnut pop. So where did I get that? Well, this has been abused and used a lot of times, but you'll just see that it says here that these are 15 by 19 green blanks. I picked this up at Lowe's for very little. It's designed to make yard sale signs or things like that out of. And my boys obviously have used it for acrylic paint. They've used it for making clay models and all sorts of things like that. But, you know, I can clean that off if I want to, or it doesn't really matter if I want to use it for another set of scales. Not a big deal, okay? You can also use inserts from another knife. Well, for example, on this one, this was one of my first ones, and so the workmanship here is really pretty bad, to be perfectly honest. But you'll see that dark green, and that dark green came from the covers of binders, those sort of flexible binder covers, that 3-ring binders that you use for paper. And it works great as well. So it doesn't really matter. Something, if you want to have those, is basically all you are going to need. The process you're going to have to do is cut those out too, trace them, cut them out, again, a little bit bigger than you need. Ultimately, you put all of this stuff together and you get some kind of epoxy. I've used all sorts of different kinds. These are just the current version that I have here, and it works fine. I put another knife together with that not too long ago. But you want to take your wood scales, you want to take the others, and I did them one at a time. I did kind of drill down through them to start with, and drill press really helps in terms of lining those up, but it's not absolutely necessary. You know, you can be a little bit off, and it's still going to be functional. May not be as aesthetically pretty, but again, this is a relatively inexpensive knife, so that wasn't something I was particularly worried about. But basically, I put epoxy on well, follow the directions, whatever directions the epoxy says in terms of that. But I put them on one side at a time, flipped it over, put the other ones on, and at that point, basically, I used some clamps, more or less like this. And what you have to imagine are just, you know, rectangular, well, not really rectangular, but roughly shaped blocks with these things sticking out. The pins that I just used a bit of this. This is 3/16 round, brass round. Got this also at Lowe's. I don't remember how much it was, but not a huge investment. But that was what I used for pins. And I just used a hacksaw to saw those to length. And then originally these were protruding through here basically as I glued it down as I was clamping it. So I had clamps all over the place on here to hold it in place. Then I just set it aside and followed the directions in terms of what the epoxy was suggesting that I do. Once that is done, the fun can begin, and that is shaping the handle however you want to shape it in whatever method or way that you want to use. I found with the wood, what I tended to do is I used a variety of different kinds of files to just kind of shape it, kind of rough shape it and then smooth it. Ultimately, the finish that I have on here came from using up to, I can't remember what the grit was, but really, really fine grit sandpaper over and over again, because I really wanted this to just, you know, feel like silk in my hand when I was holding it. I didn't want any, you know, hot spots or issues or things like that. I used a Dremel tool to kind of create these little scallops here on the side, and to sort of create some of the more subtle contours, just put a sanding drum on it. But most of the work, you know, that leaves, you know, abrasion marks. So that was kind of roughly done, and then I finished it with other more refined techniques. A lot of hand sanding. I mean, I probably spent 3-4 hours of hand sanding over the course of a couple days as I was working on this. I don't remember what the final thing was. And again, it's not perfect. There are plenty of imperfections in terms of this particular handle. But as you can see, it works. It gives it that kind of bushcraft sort of look to it. And I've really enjoyed using the knife. put a little bit better edge on it than came when it first came out, and that's it. So you just have to keep playing with it and fiddling with it and getting it so that the handle fits your hand and feels good to you, and then sighting it. I sighted it down the side a lot and said, okay, is it even on both sides, and kept twisting and turning. It becomes this sort of compulsion after a while as you're working on that. But that's basically it. It's not that big of a deal. So thank you for asking the question. I hope this has helped you in terms of understanding sort of the process I went through. I would love for my followers who have done similar things to if they have videos that they've created while they're doing it, feel free to post a link to a video in the comments below. Feel free to add comments, suggestions, things like that if you see something that I could do better, if you have comments about any part of the process. But this is basically just something I did for me. I wanted to kind of embrace this little experiment and see what happened, and that's what I did, and this is what it was produced by it. I think if I were doing it again, the only thing I would really do differently is get a hollowed brass tube for the lanyard hole, but that's not a big deal. Obviously it's perfectly functional. It still has a piece of steel in there, and that's about it. So this is Bentbrook. Thank you for watching another little short video here about how I had created this scales, the handles for this Schrade SCHF 56L. Hope you liked it, and I really appreciate you taking the time to watch this and consider what I did, and I hope it helped you. If you're interested in trying to do this on your own, don't be discouraged. It really is a pretty simple kind of process. If you have a handful of basic tools, you can really do it quite well. Bentbrook out.